So we're going live. And today we're planning to talk about night photography and astrophotography. And it would probably be good, because I'm going to ask a lot of questions, if people unmute themselves when they want to answer. So there's one big difference between daytime photography and nighttime photography. It's kind of obvious. If somebody wants to chime in, what's the huge difference? Nobody wants to pick that up?
No light.
I
Well,
say lighting.
yeah, much less light. And that implies a bunch of difficulties. For one thing, the lack of light means the exposures are probably going to be long to very long if you want low ISOs. And for another thing, it's hard to focus. So when you're going out to do night photography, you usually have to go out with a flashlight on a tripod and have a pretty clear idea what you're going to do. So the real first step is to have everything you need and go out. So I assume you have a DSLR and that you either have bulb mode or time mode. On my D5100, the bulb mode requires the manual shutter, and the time mode requires the remote. On other cameras, it's different. But because you're going to be doing, in most cases, long exposures, longer than your camera will time it automatically, you need one or the other. You also have to think about what kind of lens you're going to use, because that'll depend on what kind of subject you want to capture, and that will also affect your exposure time. I'll get to that. The other thing that's not obvious that I've forgotten at least once is that you're going to use up most of your battery. So you have to come with a fresh battery and possibly a spare. So how do you focus at night? Anybody? Not so easy.
That's a great question, Martin. I've seen, set your focus to infinity if we're talking about, astrophotography. Not sure on the night side, but glad to hear what your suggestions are there. So I'm not quite sure what infinity means.
On many cameras, it's very hard to get infinity accurately. So what you have to do is either go hyperfocal, so focus on something bright that's, say, 10 or 15 meters away, or focus on something at infinity like the moon. It's very easy to focus on the moon. It's not so easy to do it manually. Uh, it's actually fairly easy to do it automatically, but then you don't want it to hunt. Once you've got a good focus, you want to switch your focus back to manual.
So
Let,
if I could just add something here.
please.
One of the things that I like to do, basically you got to decide, are you going to be doing astrophotography, night photography that requires you to be infinity, or are you going to focus at things that are particularly closer? So
Exactly. That's why I mentioned hyperfocal.
right. So assume for a moment that you're planning to do stars and you're planning to do, night photography with star trails or whatever it is. Then the preference, the way I like to do it, is if you have a manual lens, then the manual lens clearly has an infinity mark or an infinity stop, where the focus ring will actually stop at infinity. But most modern lenses actually tend to go beyond infinity. And there is a reason for that, because if there was a hard stop at infinity, eventually the gears would wear out. So the lens will go beyond infinity and then come back to infinity. So my recommendation is as follows. You set your camera to focus on, let's say, clouds or the moon, as Martin suggested. The manual lens clearly has an infinity mark or an infinity stop, where the focus ring will actually stop at infinity. But most modern lenses actually tend to go beyond infinity. And there is a reason for that, because if there was a hard stop at infinity, I don't know why this is playing back. So you'll go beyond infinity and then come back to infinity. So my recommendation is as follows. You set your camera to focus on, let's say, clouds or the moon, as Martin suggested. The manual lens clearly has an infinity mark or an infinity stop, where the focus ring will actually stop at infinity. But most modern lenses actually tend to go beyond it.
Yeah, it was coming from Catherine for some reason.
Oh, okay. All right. So just to repeat, so you basically, what you want to do is, if you have a focusing ring that is not on a manual lens, get yourself some gaffer's tape, or get yourself even some, painter's masking tape. The blue one from Scotch is the best because it leaves no residue. The white ones will tend to leave residue. So what you do is you tape your focusing ring to the body of your lens, so that you don't invert. You don't move. Oh, okay. All right. So just to repeat. So you basically, what you want to do is, if you have focusing. Okay, it keeps coming. All right. So the next thing. I
muted you, Catherine. Leave it that way.
Yeah. So what you do then is, now you focus your lens to an infinity, defined infinity like the clouds or the moon, and then switch your lens into manual mode. Now, once you switch it into manual mode, it's basically locked on infinity, and at night, inadvertently, you will not be able to move the focusing ring because it's actually taped. And since it's a circular ring, just about a 1-inch piece of tape is good enough to hold it in place. And then, the next morning when you're done with your photography, you can pull it off. If you are focusing on closer subjects, clearly then there are 2 ways to do it. And I love Martin's suggestion, is that if you don't want to take any chances, definitely go ahead and use hyperfocal distance with some understanding of approximately where your subject is going to be. But assume for a moment that you don't really have your little hyperfocal table with you, or you don't fully understand hyperfocal distances, and yet you want to focus on a subject that is at an unknown distance. If you carry a good flashlight with you, that's one way to do it. Direct your flashlight at the subject, really light it up, focus, and then turn the flashlight off. But if you have somebody who's with you, accompanying you, then it's even easier, because you then have them take the flashlight closer to the point where you want to focus, and you focus on the subject with it being lit by your partner, whoever's there with you. So those are your options as far as focusing in the dark is concerned. Go ahead, Martin.
You covered all my points about focusing, except focusing on the moon. And let me go back to that. It's usually easy to focus on the moon automatically, and the rest of the tricks that Shiv just described are very useful. It's a little harder to get exposures right with the moon. So if we're shooting the moon, we're usually going to want a long focal length on our lens. I usually use a 300 millimeter lens with a 1.5 equivalent factor, so it's 450 35 millimeter equivalent. And I switch to point metering. And in fact, with point metering and aperture priority, I can sometimes shoot the moon handheld and have it come out right. If it's not that bright, handheld will shake, so then you need to be on the tripod. You need to turn off your VR or whatever the equivalent is on your camera, and if your metering doesn't give you what you want, then you have to look at the histogram. So you have to shoot and chimp, and you can't really tell from the image whether it's over or underexposed. The moon tends to be overexposed most of the time, but you can certainly tell by looking at the histogram. When you're shooting stars or night skies, you almost always are underexposed, and you have to compensate for that. So one way to compensate for that is first to set up your composition. And if it's a big sky with a landscape, you're going to use a very wide lens. 24 is often good length. And turn the ISO way up. So shoot it at 3200 or 6400. And go ahead and chimp. You're going to take 5 or 10 seconds at most for that exposure. And you can then convert from the exposure at high ISO with a correct looking histogram to the correct exposure for a very low ISO. And there are apps both on Android and iOS that will do that for you automatically. You just have to punch in the numbers. Claudia, could you get that cat? Sorry about that. I'm sorry. Think about the cat interrupted me. The real trick in the night photography, there's bunches of them. One is that if you're at high ISO and you underexpose, you're going to have terrible noise. And even if you have low ISO and you're underexposed, you're going to have a lot of noise. If you go beyond 30 seconds, your sensor is likely to heat up and you'll have noise. It depends on the actual camera, which is going to be worse. If you do a long exposure and let your camera compensate for the noise, it's going to take twice as long. So if you took an hour's exposure, it's then going to take a second exposure with the shutter closed for an hour. And so then you're out there for 2 hours, usually in the cold, trying to get your one exposure. So maybe it's good to make sure before you take that your composition and your exposure are correct. When you combine the landscape with the stars, you often have an issue of needing different exposures for both of them. And one way to handle that is to compose them later. So take 2 exposures, one short one for the landscape and one longer one for the stars. Another way is to do star stacking, which is quite complicated and involves extra software, so I'm really not going to go into that tonight.
So Martin, before you go into stacking, let me just add a few things to what you've already said, and all of it is great. One of the things that you need to just consider is think about the moon being nothing more than the sun, because after all, the sun is reflecting its light off the moon, which is coming back to us. So in the most part, if you're familiar with the Sunny 16 rule, that is a good place to start your exposure. So if you are aware of Sunny 16, it basically says if you have your aperture set at f16, if your ISO is about 100 or 160, if it's capable of doing that, and you shoot at a shutter speed of between 100 and 160th of a second, you should get a pretty good starting point for your exposure. But that's usually when the moon is nearly full. And as the moon wanes or waxes, you need to compensate for that. And if you look on Google, there are lots of tables and lots of people explain what that's going to do for you. So that's, from a starting point, it's a quick and easy way to say, let me set this, that's my first exposure. I'll now look at my histogram and adjust accordingly. Because you don't want, clearly, as Martin said very correctly, you do not want your moon to blow out, and it's very easy for the moon to blow out. As far as stars are concerned, again, exposure, very good suggestions. Keep one thing in mind. Determine what your intent is. If you want your stars to be pinpoints, then your shutter speed or the amount of time you keep your lens open is very critical based upon the focal length you're using. If you are looking to do star trails, and that's why I said let me put this in before Martin talks about stacking, if you want to do star trails by stacking, then you definitely want your stars to elongate a little bit, move a little bit, so that when you stack, they don't look like dotted lines, but actually look like one continuous line. And time, or shutter time, is dependent upon 2 things. One, your focal length, and there is a 500 rule, which basically says...
That was the next thing I was going to cover.
Right. But keep in mind that the 500 rule is kind of gone down into the tubes, because modern sensors with that much more pixel density are more prone to star trailing even well before the 500 rule can kick in. So you may, in fact, even have to go to a new 1/400 rule or even a 300 rule based upon the sensor size that you have. Go ahead, Martin.
Okay. So repeating the essence of what Shiv just said, if you want star trails, you're going to have long exposures. But how long you can go for pinpoint stars is a matter of your focal length. And the 500 rule is that your maximum shutter speed is 500 over your focal length, with the focal length being the 35 millimeter equivalent and the shutter speed being in seconds. So with the 500 rule and a 100 millimeter lens, then you can only go 5 seconds. With the older sensors, as Shiv said, before you'll start to get motion in the stars. They'll no longer look like pinpoints. If you have tight sensors, then that's going to be 300 over the focal length, or 3 seconds for a 100 millimeter length. For a 24 millimeter lens, with the 500 rule, it's 20 seconds, and the 300 rule, it's going to be 12, 14 seconds. So you'll have to experiment if you really want pinpoints to see where it is for your camera. And on the subject of rules, there's another rule for the moon that I like to use, which is the 11 rule, which says that at f11 and 100 ISO, you expose at 11 over the focal length in millimeters. Now, whether that is actually going to work, it's a first cut. It's just like the Sunny 16 rule. You're going to have to look at your histogram to get an accurate indication of what you've really got and then adjust. So going back to star photography, I mentioned taking a high ISO test shot. When you're going from that high ISO test shot to your long exposure, you do have to keep in mind the issue of, do you want star trails or not? And then you have to envision what your star trails are going to look like, because they're going to completely change the way your composition looks. What you see through the viewfinder or on the back of your camera is not going to show the trails, and you're going to have to imagine, oh, in an hour they're going to go that far. So, let's allow for that in the composition. Now, I guess I didn't really ask how many of you know what hyperfocal distance actually means. Something that us old-timers know. So Catherine's saying yes? Yeah. Karen's not opening her eyes. Karen, no. Doesn't know hyperfocal.
I just looked it up, so that's as much as I know now.
You know, on an old-fashioned lens, let's see if I can pull one out. On an old-fashioned manual lens, can you see that? Can you see the second ring? That actually shows you what the hyperfocal depth of field is for any particular stop on the lens. And on the manual lens, that was easy. You just in rangefinder cameras as well. The farther away it is, the more depth of field you're going to have at any given setting. When things are very close, you're going to have very little depth of field. And it also varies with your aperture. So shooting wide open and very close gives you a tiny depth of field. Shooting almost closed and very far away gives you a very big depth of field. And in many cases, if you shoot at, say, the 11 to 16 range on your f-stop, and you focus 40 or 50 meters away, you can keep things in focus through infinity. So you can have a landscape with mountains in the background and clouds and stars behind that where everything's in focus. If you try to do that at f2.8, it's just not going to work. So you've got this big balancing act when you're shooting at night between how much depth of field do I want? Do I want the stars to move? Do I want the stars to be fixed? How much noise can I tolerate? Do I want to let my camera take care of the noise automatically, which will double my exposure time? Or do I want to take care of my noise in post-processing? And I've tried it all. It varies on which camera I'm using, which is really the best thing. It also varies with which software I'm using to clean up the noise. Do you guys have experience here? I know Shiv does. Catherine or no? Troy? No. Shiv, do you want to address this?
Yeah, so a couple of things. Hyperfocal distance, just to start with, is not just for night photography. It's for really any kind of photography, whether it be landscapes or, architectural scenes, whatever you want to do, where you want lots of things from front to back to be in focus. Two very simple guidelines that I would suggest is that the wider open your aperture, the shallower your depth of field. The tighter your aperture, the more depth of field you have. But all lenses suffer from a problem. At the tightest aperture, typically lenses tend to have a certain amount of light bending or diffraction taking place that causes images to look like they're out of focus. Even though they may not be out of focus, they'll appear that way. So stay away from very tight apertures. The concept or the understanding of hyperfocal distance really comes from a very simple guideline. In reality, there is only one plane of focus. Your focus cannot be from point A to point B. It is what we perceive to be in good focus. So point A to point B, as our eyes perceive it, of acceptable focus is what we're looking for. Now, as far as tools are concerned, there are an innumerable number of tables and tools available. Make sure that when you use these tools, you fully understand that you're going to set your hyperfocal distance based upon two things: the focal length of your lens and the aperture, based upon the size of the sensor you have. So the hyperfocal distance for a full frame sensor will be different than an APS-C sensor, even though you may be using the same lens and the same aperture setting. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is the more magnification you have, the shallower the depth of field is going to be. So zoom lenses with high magnification tend to deplete some of the depth of field. Wide-angle lenses, very small focal lengths, will always, for the same aperture, give you much greater depth of field. So as Martin said, this is a juggling act. There are many variables, and over time, as you start looking at hyperfocal distances, you will realize that you don't have to focus at the place which you believe is what you want to be in focus. If you need something in focus from 5 feet in front of you to infinity, it's very easy to...
You muted, Shiv.
Sorry, go ahead.
You muted before you finished.
Oh, I'm sorry. What I was trying to say is that let's assume for a moment you're doing a landscape scene and you want things to be in focus from 5 feet in front of you all the way to the big mountain range at infinity. It is ideal to apply a quasi-hyperfocal distance, which would say, don't bother focusing on the mountains, don't bother focusing on the 5 feet in front of you. Assume you can focus about 1/3, approximately 1/3 of the way into the scene with your aperture set at about f16, and you will have good front to back focus. Does that make kind of sense?
Yeah, that's roughly the way I do it.
Because it's not always possible that we carry tables with us, or we'll always have our iPhone, and the iPhone, I mean, there is a very nice app. It's called Field Tools. And Field Tools, I think it's like, I don't know if it's free or maybe 99 cents. It gives you very, very defined tables based upon lenses, focal lengths, and sensor size. One of the biggest mistakes people make is that when they are using a zoom lens, they will look at a hyperfocal table, set the hyperfocal distance, and then recompose by zooming in or out. Well, there goes your hyperfocal distance. It's now changed. So be cognizant of that too.
Yeah, this is a case where shooting digital, we can get away with a lot because we can chimp our scene. In the old days shooting film, you either had to know or guess, and you didn't get away with anything. You couldn't correct it on the scene unless you bracketed and did all the stuff you didn't want to do because you were worrying about how much all the film developing was going to cost you. Did any of you bring some of your night photography to show us? Catherine says no. Karen says no. Troy?
excuse me, I just have the images that I posted in the cohort from the 4th of July this past time, so it's my attempt at doing some fireworks, but that's all I have right now.
Well, those would be good to talk about.
Okay. Yeah, so we could bring those up and take a look if you'd like to.
Sure, go ahead and share your screen.
You may have to point me in the direction here. I've never shared this screen before, so.
Okay, over at the left-hand side.
There it is.
By the way, Catherine, I liked your blurs.
Are you able to see anything?
I see a nested face of me.
Wrong screen. Let me switch it around. How's that?
That's better. Okay, well, we'll have to give it a minute to.
I did not mean to advance that. Hold on a second.
Yeah.
I'm trying to go back to the beginning. Oh, here we go. Okay, there we go. I was trying to make it full screen, but it wasn't cooperating.
Just leave it, because it takes a few seconds for the whole thing to paint on our screens, just because of the delay in Google Plus. So what I've been seeing is the blue gets stronger and stronger, and some of the other parts getting clearer. So this is very interesting.
Martin?
Yes.
Click on Troy's screen so that
I did.
anybody else who talks will not show, only Troy's screen will show.
I already did that, Shiv.
Okay.
So this is a good example. Do you want to talk about it a little bit, Troy?
Sure. 4th of July evening. I didn't have the best vantage point, as you'll see by the screen. It kind of looks like the image is kind of, more towards the bottom of the frame, not really centered or even off center. But I was really just going after trying to get something, honestly. I wasn't quite sure how it was going to come out. Playing around with various settings, mainly was trying to get, excuse me, the length of the exposure, and then just trying to get something in focus. The focus seemed to be come out somewhat okay, and as I learned, it takes very minute adjustments on the exposure length to really get something. This one was at 2 seconds of exposure length, and I really wasn't going after the trails as you see there. I was really trying to capture the fireworks as they happened, and that's it. Just the lines, and that was it. I wasn't trying to get past that. So some unexpected results, not horrible, but definitely a learning experience.
When I shoot fireworks, I'm happy to get anything. And hope that I set it up right. Now, I find except for the lights at the bottom, I find the rest of this kind of nice. I like the way the wind's blowing the particles, and I like some of the blurred stuff behind or what I think is behind the fireworks, or those distant lights.
No, no, you're right. Those are remnants of prior, explosions, if you will,
Ah, got
that are
it,
still hanging in the clouds behind it.
got it. I've had very interesting results with um, fireworks coming out of heavy smoke at the end of a display. Although people say you shouldn't do that, that you should try to get them early. But of
Well, I,
course,
I
there's
tell you
always
one
a
thing.
grand finale.
Yeah, I tell you one thing that was difficult, honestly, on fireworks, and you may be able to share your experience, but it's timing, right? Trying to time the whole release of the shutter with the explosion, with the letting go. It's kind of
Yes.
just a hit or miss learning curve there.
Um, I know that Shiv has a camera where he can see the image developing as it happens and end the exposure when he wants to. I'm not that lucky, but I do tend to like to use bulb mode or time mode when I'm shooting fireworks so that I can start as it goes up and stop it when I think it's going to start um, breaking up. But
So,
it's
so,
so
so this
easy.
was done in bulb mode. You're right. Obviously, this was done on a tripod, and I had a remote in hand. So basically, I sat there. I framed my image where I thought it was going to happen first. I had the camera set up, and then I had my hand on the remote. And as soon as I would hear or see the trail leave the ground, I would kind of hit the remote, wait for it, and then close the shutter with the remote. And that's kind of how the approach I took for this.
Yeah, there's another trick for that, which I've seen a couple places, and I know Shiv does, and that's to put um, a black cloth in front of the lens between bursts. And that allows you to keep the shutter open for, say, 30 seconds and overlay multiple bursts on one exposure.
Okay.
You
Let
want
me.
to address why that helps, Shiv? No? Okay, well, Troy, do you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, I mean, same setup, different exposure length, which is, here's where I come into some unknown areas for myself, which I'm always looking for guidance. The last picture was a shorter exposure length, but seemed to have greater trails, if you will. Um, this exposure is 4 seconds in length instead of two, but you'll notice, at least I notice, at least on the top starburst there, it's more crisp on the lines. Now there are trails in different places, but I don't know if that was just a phenomenon of the angle I took it on or what. But it looks a little different, and it's a longer exposure.
I don't really know why. You have two more, right? So that lower one looks like it's the the kind that sends a lot of little sparks out.
Yep, exactly right. Was making an attempt to get them.
Yeah, and this one has a lot of smoke in it.
Yeah, and this is the longest exposure. This was 9 seconds, and honestly, I think it's my favorite personally. But there's a lot going on, but it's all, in my opinion, it's all pretty much tightly put together. It's pretty much all in focus, and I don't know, it just looks really sharp to me.
Well, I like it.
In 1.1 miles.
Troy, a couple of things, if I may add. These are really great images for if you let's say this is not something you do often because you managed to get some really exceptional stuff. And also I think think the atmospheric conditions really helped you. Under normal circumstances, if you're going to shoot fireworks, positioning yourself is very important. You don't want to be where the wind is blowing towards you from the fireworks, because that's where all the smoke's going to be, and you're going to end up with a lot of blurry images just because of the dispersion from the smoke. So you always want to try and position yourself upwind, as they would say, rather than downwind. The other thing is, varying your exposure time also depends upon what kind of fireworks there are. If there is a rhythm, if they're doing the same thing over and over again, then it's quite easy to do a couple of test shots and say, oh, okay, a 4-second exposure works or a 6-second exposure works. But if the fireworks are varying in the way they're let off and the kind of explosions that they have, a lot of it becomes experimental. So what you've got is great. As far as focus is concerned, I think what Martin discussed earlier, focus on infinity. Typically the fireworks are well above 20, 30 meters, and beyond that you're really running most of your stuff at infinity, and with your aperture set at about f8 or thereabouts, you will have enough depth of field to capture the explosion in its entirety. One of the things that I like to do at times, and if you've got a camera like an Nikon, which has very good ISO performance, is open up your shutter, but make yourself a little card with any kind of cardboard or foam core board, and stick a piece of velvet on it. And then what you can do is, pour the velvet cardboard in front of your lens so that you're blocking off all the light. And as soon as the explosion goes off and it's reached the right elevation, and it just about explodes, release the velvet. And then when the explosion is over, cover your lens and wait for the next one and open it. So in about 20 seconds, you can sometimes capture 2 or 3 or 4 overlays of explosions, and that looks really very nice. So, again, it's from an experimental point of view, but that technique I've found works inordinately well if these fireworks are sporadic. I mean, if they've got like tons of stuff going on, then it's no problem. You're going to get it anyway. But if it's, one, and then they wait, and then there's another one, then it waits, and then there's another one, then the velvet trick works really well.
Take ramp.
Thank you for sharing that tip. It actually makes a lot of sense, because the whole game of trying to time it correctly with a remote and all that, you kind of throw that out the window, because now it sounds like you're being able to quickly just put something in front of the lens and remove it with your hand so fast that now you're not worrying about jostling the camera, timing it, or pushing any kind of release on the shutter. You're just moving it. So definitely we'll have to try that.
Yeah, give that a shot. You'll love it. I mean, I that's the only way I do it.
Great. Martin, I'll kick the screen back over to you.
Well,
So sorry, Martin, go ahead.
no, I think we're pretty much done for tonight, unless people have questions.
Continue 2.3 miles. Then take exit 13B.
Okay, I want to just add a couple of things. If you are interested, I had written a couple of articles that are on my website in the tips and tricks section. There's an article on doing fireworks, but I don't talk about the velvet thing. Maybe I do. I don't remember if I have it in there. There's also some tables on the moon and lunar photography, and there's some on astrophotography. They're not extensive articles. They're quick, easy reading. So if you are interested in doing that, then go ahead and read it. For a continuation of this subject, I think what we've got to today is possibly a target topic that I'd like to do. And if Martin, you want to do it, or if Troy, you want to do it, or whoever, if they would like to do it, I'm happy to have that addressed. but I think we need to really do a little lesson on how to focus, where to focus, and understand hyperfocal distance. Then in conjunction with that, maybe we also talk about focus stacking so that we get really good and very high depth of field on a single composed subject. Do you think that's a good idea?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think so.
So if anybody wants to pick that topic and do it, let me know. Otherwise, I'll set some time up for next week and maybe we do another Wednesday evening.
Okay, well, thank you all.
And Martin, you want to now turn that live thing off so that you go off air and then YouTube will start processing the Hangout.
Okay, I'm doing that now.